Some people are simply incapable of understanding that efficiency matters more than feelings. That is what Dr. Caldwell said 43 minutes before his entire world collapsed. St. Michael's Hospital in Houston hums with the sterile rhythm of fluorescent lights and antiseptic air, cold steel gurneys rolling across polished floors like ships passing in fog. Danielle Ross moves through the ICU with the kind of invisible competence that makes her forgettable. Shoulders square. Hands steady. Eyes down. She changes for bags with movements too precise for civilian training, her fingers never fumbling as she checks the drip rate, 18 milliliters per hour, exactly as prescribed. In her scrub pocket, she carries a tarnished military challenge coin that she touches during particularly long shifts, the metal warm from her body heat, the weight of it somehow more real than anything else in this place. A thin scar runs along her left forearm, visible when she reaches for supplies, a memento from a world she was ordered to forget. She was Master Chief Petty Officer Danielle Ross once. Now she is just a nurse in the corner of a hospital that doesn't know her name. The hallway smells like bleach and something underneath it, the particular odor of bodies fighting to stay alive, a copper undertone beneath chemical cleaners. Danielle's boots make no sound on the tile. She learned long ago how to move through spaces without being noticed. After 18 years in the Navy, 3 deployments to Tikrit, 2 Purple Hearts, 17 classified operations, she learned that invisibility is survival. Then the order came. Operation Sandstorm had gone sideways. Her records were scrubbed. Her existence was erased. Master Chief Petty Officer Danielle Ross was listed as missing in action, presumed dead after a classified operation went dark. And Danielle Ross the nurse was born in the ashes of a life that officially never happened. She rebuilt everything in silence. A studio apartment in Northwest Houston. A daughter who would be 8 in 3 months. A job at a hospital where nobody asked questions about the gaps in her employment history. A routine that kept her alive but unremarkable. Invisible. Safe. The ICU is a grid of 12 beds arranged in a horseshoe, each one an island of fluorescent light and mechanical breathing. Danielle works the corner bay, the one by the window where sunlight doesn't quite reach, where patients are sometimes forgotten because they're slightly out of sight lines. Today, that bed holds Marcus Webb. 32 years old. Deaf since childhood. Purple Heart recipient. Admitted 4 days ago with endocarditis, an infection eating through his heart valves like rust through steel. He lies propped against pillows, his eyes following the monitors above his head, watching the numbers the way other people watch television. He has no family listed. No visitors recorded. No one checking the call button. Danielle approaches the bedside, her hands already moving into the rhythm of care, checking the monitor, reading the vital signs, confirming the medications running through his 4 lines. Marcus turns to look at her. His eyes are intelligent and exhausted and utterly isolated. She sets down her tablet and holds his gaze for a moment longer than protocol requires. Then she points to herself, to him, to the 2 of them. She places her palms together and slowly moves them apart. A sign she learned 17 minutes ago on her phone while standing in the medication room. It means something like open. Honest. Available. Marcus's eyes widen slightly. It is the smallest possible gesture of recognition. Danielle begins to move her hand slowly, deliberately, pulling fragments of American Sign Language from YouTube videos watched at 3 a.m. in her apartment while her daughter slept. She signs badly. The letters are clumsy. Her hand positions are not textbook. But she signs, and Marcus watches, and the isolation around him seems to crack, just slightly. She points to the 4. Then to her chest. Then to her watch face. She is telling him the medication is running, his heart is beating, and time is moving forward. Information. Not comfort. Just the facts delivered in a language he can understand. The words come slower than usual. Her hands move through the signs like she's working through cold water. She signs her name, the civilian name, the only one that matters now. Danielle. She points to the badge clipped to her scrubs. She points to herself again and makes a fist, then opens her fingers, a sign for help. "I am here to help." Marcus watches her hands. His shoulders lower slightly. The tension around his mouth eases. He reaches out his arm slowly and touches her wrist, just below the scar. It is the first time anyone has intentionally touched her in weeks, not a bump in a hallway, not an accidental brush. A deliberate human acknowledgement. Her instinct, ingrained from years of covert operations, is to withdraw. But she doesn't. She lets his hand rest there for 3 seconds. Then she returns to work, checking the central line with the kind of precise technique that only comes from thousands of hours of field medicine in places that don't exist on any official map. Dr. Caldwell arrives on rounds at 7:24 a.m. He sweeps through the ICU like a man who owns the oxygen he breathes, trailing a wake of residents in white coats who hurry to keep pace. His voice carries across the unit, loud, confident, authoritative, discussing patient management as though the patients themselves are abstractions. His tie costs $200. His watch is an Omega, at least the $12,000 version. His shoes are polished to a shine that would pass military inspection. He has never once stepped on a battlefield. He has never once held a dying soldier. But he moves through this hospital as though he owns every heartbeat inside it. Caldwell approaches the corner bay. Danielle is still at Marcus Webb's bedside. She is demonstrating something with her hands, showing him how to position his arm to prevent the fall from kinking. She has been here for 23 minutes. Protocol allocates 12 minutes per patient on rounds. Nurse Ross. Caldwell doesn't ask a question. His voice simply interrupts the space between them. "The patient can wait while we discuss his chart." Danielle steps back from the bedside. She moves with the fluid, practiced efficiency of someone who has learned not to waste energy on unnecessary responses. She holds Marcus's gaze for 1 more second, a silent promise that she will return, and then she turns to face the doctor. "Yes, doctor," she says. Her voice is quiet. Deferential. Exactly what he expects. Caldwell discusses Marcus Webb's condition without looking at him. Endocarditis. Fever curve finally declining. Antibiotics continuing at current dosage. The patient is expected to require valve replacement in 6 to 8 weeks, pending stabilization. It is all clinical. All data. No acknowledgement that the words being spoken about exist as a human being 12 inches away in the same room. Caldwell never once makes eye contact with Marcus Webb. His gaze sweeps across the monitors, the 4 pumps, the ventilator displays, but never settles on the man. The rounds move on. 2 beds down, 3 beds down, until Caldwell and his entourage exit through the double doors with a pneumatic hiss. The fluorescent lights buzz in the sudden quiet. Danielle returns to the corner bay. Marcus is staring at the ceiling. His hands rest on the blanket, fingers still in the position she left them. She approaches the bedside again and makes the sign for return, her hand moving away from her body and then swinging back. "I will come back." 43 minutes, Caldwell says to the resident trailing behind him as they walk down the hallway. His voice carries easily through the open ICU doors. "Did you notice?" The resident, a younger man, maybe 28, wearing the nervous expression of someone perpetually afraid of saying the wrong thing, shakes his head. The nurse spent 43 minutes at that patient's bedside, Caldwell continues. Not assessing. Not providing care. Standing there making hand gestures like some kind of speech therapist. Some people simply don't understand that efficiency matters more than feelings. Nurses aren't therapists. They're not social workers. They're task-oriented professionals, and when those task parameters start to expand, it creates friction in the system. The resident nods. He writes something in his notebook. Danielle stands in the corner bay of the ICU, her hand still half raised from the sign she just made. Marcus Webb is watching her face. The challenge coin in her scrub pocket suddenly feels like it weighs 1,000 pounds. She touches it once, briefly, without looking down. Then she continues her rounds. But what Danielle doesn't know, what no one in this hospital knows, is that the mask she has worn for 4 years is about to crack in ways she cannot control. And what Caldwell doesn't realize is that the woman he just dismissed as task-oriented and inefficient is someone who has held the line in Tikrit when everything was falling apart. Someone whose hands have performed emergency medicine in conditions that would make most surgeons weep. Someone whose absence from the official record was considered necessary by the highest levels of government. He has no idea what he is standing next to. The fluorescent lights hum their mechanical rhythm. The heart monitors beep their steady pulse. The hospital continues its work, indifferent to the currents moving beneath the surface. And in the corner bay, Marcus Webb watches the nurse who learned his language sign the word for hope, though she doesn't know she's doing it. The auditorium at St. Michael's Hospital in Houston seated 200. Grand rounds happened every Tuesday at 7 a.m., which meant the chairs filled with physicians, residents, fellows, and nursing administrators who had nowhere better to be. Danielle stood in the back near the exit doors, hands folded, eyes forward, waiting for the presentation to begin. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical lullaby overhead. Dr. Caldwell walked to the podium at 7:04 a.m. precisely. He wore the kind of cologne that made the air taste like expensive regret. His tie was silk. His shoes had been polished that morning by someone paid to polish them. He smiled at the crowd the way a shark smiles at chum. "Colleagues," he began, his voice pitched to reach the back rows without appearing to try. "Today I want to discuss a phenomenon I've observed in our ICU. I call it the bleeding heart syndrome." A soft laugh rippled through the audience. Danielle's jaw tightened by 1 millimeter. This is when clinical judgment is compromised by emotional investment in patient outcomes beyond our scope of practice. He gestured to the projection screen. Her time logs appeared, magnified across 20 feet of wall. "Here we have documentation from Nurse Ross," Caldwell continued, his finger tracing the highlighted entries. On March 14, she spent 23 minutes with patient Webb, a deaf male admitted with post-surgical complications. The documented time included teaching herself basic sign language. He paused, letting the implication breathe. Not assessing. Not medicating. Not charting. Learning. The room held its breath the way rooms do when someone is about to be dismantled in front of an audience. "What concerns me," Caldwell said, voice dropping to that tone medical professionals use when discussing patient safety, which made it sound like she'd endangered someone, "is the creeping redefinition of nursing duties. Communication is important, yes. But when communication supersedes protocol, when emotional labor replaces clinical standards, we are no longer practicing medicine. We are practicing theater." 60 physicians nodded. The sound of 60 heads moving in agreement made a whisper like wind through dead leaves. Danielle did not blink. She did not shift her weight. She did not reach for the coin in her pocket, though her right hand wanted to, the way a drowning person wants air. She had stood in an operating tent in Tikrit while mortars landed close enough to shake the surgical lights. She had held the interior of a human chest cavity in her gloved hands. She had watched a 19-year-old with a sucking chest wound ask her if he was going to die, and she had told him the truth, not today. Not on her watch. She could stand in this auditorium while a man in a silk tie told 60 doctors that she had betrayed her profession. Furthermore, Caldwell said, spreading his hands like a preacher at a pulpit, this behavior sets a dangerous precedent. If we allow scope creep in one area, where does it end? Do we let respiratory therapists prescribe medications? Do we let janitorial staff make treatment decisions? Of course not. Because those would be absurd violations of our professional boundaries. The same principle applies here. A nurse is not a social worker. A nurse is not a linguist. A nurse is a nurse. The applause started in the front row. It spread like a contagion. 60 pairs of hands came together in acknowledgement that protocol was being upheld, that boundaries were being maintained, that someone had been properly corrected and the natural order restored. Danielle walked out of the auditorium before the final burst of applause finished. She did not run. She did not cry. She descended the back stairwell, her shoes making contact with tile in a steady rhythm, step, 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 the kind of cadence that feels like meditation when you learned it on parade grounds 1,000 miles away. The ICU was quiet at 8:15 a.m. Second shift was beginning. Danielle checked her assignment, 3 patients, including Marcus Webb, who was recovering from a post-operative infection in his sternum and still hadn't spoken to anyone except in signs no one understood. She placed her hands on the medication cart and took a breath that expanded her ribs all the way to the back of her spine. Pain was information. Anger was information. Humiliation was just another form of data telling her body that she was vulnerable, exposed, one mistake away from exposure. At 2 p.m., during her break, she walked to the 4th-floor break room for coffee. The vending machine stood in an alcove near the stairwell, humming its low electric song. She was inserting dollar bills when she heard the footsteps behind her. Danielle. Not a question. A greeting that felt like a threat. She turned. Caldwell stood 5 feet away, blocking the stairwell exit. His expression had shifted into something that looked like concern, which was worse than anger. Anger was honest. "I want you to know," he said, voice low enough that only she could hear, "I'm not angry. I'm disappointed. You have real potential, but you're letting emotion cloud your judgment." He leaned against the wall. A nurse with your particular skill set might be happier at a less demanding facility. Somewhere that values hand-holding over actual medicine. Somewhere like a rehabilitation center. Or a long-term care facility. 2 security guards appeared at the far end of the corridor, positioned like bookends. Danielle noted their presence the way a soldier notes exits and sight lines. "I understand, Doctor," she said quietly. "Do you?" He smiled. "Because it doesn't seem like you do. It seems like you think working here means being able to spend however much time you want with whichever patient you want, regardless of hospital protocol." "It won't happen again," Danielle said. "I hope not. For your sake." He glanced toward the guards. "I'd hate to have to document any further protocol violations. That kind of thing can follow you. Damage your reputation. Make it difficult to find employment elsewhere." Danielle picked up her coffee and nodded once, a movement so slight it was barely visible. Caldwell smiled and walked away, his footsteps echoing down the hallway with the confidence of a man who had never experienced a consequence that mattered. The coin in her pocket weighed exactly 1.47 ounces. When Danielle was alone in the elevator, she pressed her palm against it through the fabric, feeling the profile of an anchor embossed into metal, feeling the weight of 8 years of careful silence. The next morning brought a new task. Caldwell appeared at the nurse's station at 6:50 a.m., before shift change, carrying a printed form and an expression of administrative helpfulness. "I've created a new documentation protocol," he announced, loud enough for 3 residents to hear. "Nurse Ross, these new patient interaction logs will help us ensure you're meeting our standards. 15-minute increments, in addition to your regular charting. Starting today." The form was 17 pages. Danielle took it without comment, without argument, without the tremor that wants to happen when you're being dismantled one brick at a time. "I appreciate your cooperation," Caldwell said. "We're all just trying to maintain excellence here." A physical therapist 3 desks away pretended to be absorbed in her laptop screen. A respiratory therapist suddenly needed to check something in the supply closet. The art of making someone invisible while they're being publicly corrected. Danielle clipped the form to her badge and turned to Marcus Webb's room. The coin pressed against her hip like a ticking clock. Like a promise she'd made 8 years ago when a government agency told her to disappear, told her that her service record would be scrubbed, told her that the woman who had coordinated operations in Tikrit would cease to exist. She had walked out of that meeting and become a nurse. She had learned to be small. She had learned to be invisible. She had learned to keep her hands steady and her eyes forward and her past buried so deep that sometimes she believed it was just a dream. But then she walked into the ICU and found a deaf veteran lying in a corner bed, abandoned by people who didn't know his language, and something in her that had been sleeping for 8 years woke up. During the morning rounds, a man in army combat fatigues appeared at the ICU entrance. He wore the sleeve patch of the 75th Ranger Regiment. He carried himself with the particular ease of someone who had survived things most people couldn't imagine. His eyes were searching. Danielle was adjusting the central line on Marcus Webb's for setup, using the three-point anchor technique, the method that stabilizes a line by securing it at the insertion point, the catheter hub, and the tubing junction. It was a precise, delicate movement that required muscle memory developed over thousands of repetitions. It was the kind of movement that could only be learned one place, taught one way, perfected by one unit. The combat medic stopped. His breathing changed. His eyes locked on her hands. Danielle finished the line without acknowledging him. She checked the dressing, verified the flow rate, and documented the procedure in Webb's chart. When she turned, the medic was still watching. Their eyes met for exactly 2 seconds before Danielle gave the smallest shake of her head, a movement so subtle that Webb, lying in the bed, didn't register it. The medic understood immediately. He nodded once and turned away, but the thread had been pulled. One person in the hospital now knew. One person now carried the knowledge that the invisible nurse in the corner of the ICU was not actually invisible at all. That afternoon, while Caldwell reviewed her documentation logs with an expression of manufactured concern, Danielle sat with Marcus Webb during her break. She opened a library book she'd checked out the day before and slowly traced sign language diagrams with her finger. Her hands formed the shapes clumsily at first, muscle memory trying to resurrect itself from years of disuse. She signed that he mattered. She signed it 3 times. Webb's eyes flooded with tears. He signed something back, a question she didn't understand, and she nodded anyway because sometimes the gesture of understanding is more important than the content. Through the glass partition, Caldwell watched. She could feel his attention like pressure, like the build-up before a storm. He was a man accustomed to control, and she had just demonstrated something that made him uncomfortable. What Danielle didn't know, Caldwell had been running a kickback scheme with pharmaceutical suppliers for 36 months. $90,000 had moved through shell accounts. Her meticulous documentation style had already flagged 2 billing discrepancies that didn't align with standard protocols. Her attention to detail was a threat. What she didn't know, Caldwell was sitting at his desk at 5:06 p.m. that evening, making phone calls, weaving a narrative that would require her removal from the hospital. The first call went to the board chairman, a man named Harrison Pierce, who owed Caldwell for steering medical supply contracts toward his wife's company, contracts worth $1.2 million over 3 years. "I need to discuss a personnel matter," Caldwell said quietly. "One of my nurses is beginning to show signs of emotional instability. I'm documenting everything, but I wanted to give you a heads up before this becomes a liability issue." That afternoon, Dr. Caldwell found her by the vending machines on the 3rd floor, where the light was worst and nobody lingered. He approached with the calculated warmth of a man playing a role he perfected, the concerned mentor, the generous superior, the voice of reason. Danielle was standing with her hand still on the dollar bill slot, waiting for her coffee to drop, when his shadow fell across her shoulder. "Danielle, can we talk?" His voice carried that false concern, the kind that softens a knife before it slides between ribs. She didn't turn. The coffee dropped into the tray with a hollow plastic sound. "I've been thinking about your trajectory here." He positioned himself against the adjacent machine, his posture suggesting this was a casual chat, a peer-to-peer moment. St. Michael's demands a certain level of operational rigor. And I wonder if maybe a less demanding facility might be a better fit for your skill set. Somewhere community-based, perhaps. Where you could focus on what you do best without the pressure of a level 1 environment. Translation: leave or I will make you leave. Danielle reached for her coffee. The cup was hot. Real. Something with weight. The thing is, when a nurse begins to drift into clinical decisions, even with good intentions, it creates liability. His hands gestured smoothly, practiced. Hospital administration has to think about the bottom line. Malpractice insurance. Risk exposure. I'm sure you understand. She understood perfectly. This wasn't conversation. This was a choreographed scene. And she noticed, with the part of her mind that never stopped calculating, the 2 security guards positioned 30 feet down the hallway by the stairwell. Not blocking the exit. Not yet. Just present. Witnesses. Enforcers. A message delivered in spatial geometry. Somewhere quieter might let you remember why you went into nursing in the first place, Caldwell continued, his tone almost paternal now. Less trauma. Less chaos. More time with your daughter, I'd imagine. The mention of her daughter hit like a name spoken in a room where it had no business being. Her hand tightened on the coffee cup, but her face remained level. Her jaw didn't clench. Her breathing didn't catch. The training ran deeper than emotion, the kind of training that taught you to absorb incoming fire without flinching, to receive orders from officers you outranked while saluting with respect. She turned to him with a measured breath and gave one small nod. Not agreement. Not surrender. Acknowledgement. The way a soldier nods when receiving marching orders she'll follow to the letter before burning down everything around her. Thank you for the advice, Dr. Caldwell, she said quietly. Then she walked past him toward the stairwell, toward the 2 security guards who stepped slightly aside to let her pass, the message clear in every inch of space they didn't fill. That evening, Dr. Caldwell sat in his office on the 15th floor, behind mahogany that cost more than most nurses earned in 6 months, and made 3 phone calls. Each one was brief. Efficient. The work of a man who understood leverage. The first call went to Richard Heathcote, chairman of St. Michael's Board of Directors. Caldwell had steered a multi-million-dollar contract to Heathcote's wife's medical supply distribution company 3 years prior, a contract that had netted the family somewhere north of $7.4 million in net profit. Heathcote answered on the first ring because men like Caldwell always got answered. Richard, I need to discuss a personnel matter that's creating institutional risk, Caldwell said, his voice carrying the weight of a man solving problems. One of our ICU nurses has begun overstepping her scope of practice during critical moments. It's creating liability. I'm concerned about negligence exposure in the future. 40 seconds. That's all it took. By the time he hung up, Heathcote had already assured him that these matters get handled, and that Caldwell could count on the administration's support in any personnel action he deemed necessary. The second call went to Dr. Marcus Webb, no relation to his patient, a former colleague from Caldwell's residency who now worked as a state health inspector overseeing hospital compliance protocols. This conversation was more nuanced. Caldwell needed to plant a seed without explicitly asking someone to do something they shouldn't. Marcus, I've got a situation where a nurse in our ICU is making independent clinical decisions without physician authorization. Standard scope of practice violation. I'm wondering if maybe something like that falls under your purview for facility inspection. His voice was light, conversational. Almost apologetic for the imposition. What Caldwell was actually doing was requesting a surprise state inspection that would focus on ICU nursing protocols, the kind of inspection that could unearth a dozen minor violations in any hospital and paint any single nurse as the focal point of institutional failure. A target. I can see what we have scheduled, Dr. Marcus Webb replied carefully, understanding perfectly what Caldwell was asking. Might be good to do a routine check anyway. When's convenient? By the end of that week, Caldwell assured him. The third call was to an attorney named Harrison Pierce, a man who'd built a 7-figure practice representing hospitals in employment disputes. Pierce specialized in what he called clean terminations, the kind where the paperwork was ironclad, the documentation was airtight, and the employee walked out with nothing but a check and a non-disclosure agreement they could never violate. I need to terminate someone, Caldwell said without preamble. A nurse who's created a liability situation. I need the documentation to hold up in any review. I need it bulletproof. Pierce understood immediately. Scope of practice violation during critical incident. Exactly. Timeline. We need to move fast. Within the week, ideally. Pierce didn't ask why. Men like Pierce never asked why. They understood that plausible deniability was the entire business model. I'll draft a termination letter citing unauthorized clinical practice and patient endangerment. You'll need to document 3 instances of protocol violation. They don't have to be major, just consistent. Show a pattern. Make it institutional risk, not personal. I can do that, Caldwell said. And he could. Danielle had spent her weeks at St. Michael's trying to be invisible, which meant she'd been visible in exactly the ways that could be reframed as liability. Every moment she'd spent with Marcus Webb trying to communicate with him in sign language, the thing Caldwell had publicly humiliated her for, could now be documented as unauthorized patient contact without physician directive. Every time she'd advocated for a patient treatment plan could be recorded as a nurse attempting to direct clinical care. The paperwork wrote itself. By the time Caldwell hung up with Pierce, the architecture of her destruction was already being assembled. Not crude. Not obvious. Institutional. The kind of thing that felt inevitable, that moved through channels and protocols, that protected everyone involved in the demolition. He stood and looked out his window at the Houston skyline, the glass reflecting his face back at him, confident, untouchable, a man who understood how systems worked and how to weaponize them. What he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that the woman he'd just coordinated to eliminate had spent for years as Master Chief Petty Officer of a Special Forces team that specialized in exactly this kind of operation, identifying threats, dismantling leverage points, and systematically neutralizing institutional corruption. And what he definitely didn't know was that his phone calls, made from his hospital office on the secure system he believed was confidential, were already being documented by someone who understood surveillance the way most people understood breathing. But that wasn't the worst part of what was coming. The worst part was that Dr. Caldwell had just set into motion the exact sequence of events that would bring the full attention of people he couldn't see, people whose authority superseded everything he thought he controlled, people whose involvement would end not just his career, but his entire architecture of power. He settled back into his mahogany chair, poured himself a scotch from the crystal decanter on his desk, and smiled at his own competence. He had no idea what was about to walk through those doors. The monitor screamed. One continuous wail that froze the entire post-op recovery wing into absolute silence. Marcus Webb's sternotomy incision, the precise surgical closure that had taken Dr. Caldwell 45 minutes to stitch, simply opened. Dehisced. The technical term meant nothing to the 3 nurses and 2 residents who watched it happen. What they saw was a chest cavity splitting like rotted fruit, the pericardium membrane separating, blood spilling across fresh white bandages. What they saw was a man flatline. Dr. Caldwell stood at the bedside, scalpel still in his hand from the final closure check. His fingers trembled. Not a small shake. A visible, unmistakable vibration that made the instrument rattle against the instrument tray. His eyes went wide, not focused, not assessing, just wide and empty like a man watching his own career evaporate in real time. The residents looked at him. Waiting. He opened his mouth. Closed it. The silence stretched for 2 full seconds while Marcus Webb's oxygen saturation climbed toward 0. 2 seconds in cardiac arrest is a century. The brain begins dying at second 3. Danielle moved before the thought finished forming. She was there because she'd been standing in the doorway with fresh gauze, routine post-op protocol, invisible as always. She saw Caldwell freeze. She saw the residents paralyzed. She saw a man who'd learned to communicate through her hands, who told her his name meant nothing to anyone in this hospital except her, bleeding out in front of 8 people who didn't know how to save him. Her gloves snapped on like gunshots. She didn't ask permission. Didn't say excuse me. Didn't waste breath on words. She pushed past Caldwell with the kind of force that made him stumble backward, and then her hands were inside Marcus Webb's chest. Not hesitating. Not second-guessing. Her fingers found the heart, a slippery, alien organ that had stopped pumping, and began the rhythm that muscle memory had burned into her hands during a dozen field surgeries in Tikrit, during nights when the only light came from muzzle flashes and the only sound was screaming. Direct cardiac massage. Hands on living heart. Compression. Release. Compression. Release. Get me a 14-gauge needle, she said. Not a question. Not a request. A command that made the senior resident move before his brain caught up with his feet. Epi, 1 milligram, push now, she continued, and the other resident fumbled toward the crash cart like a man in a current. Her hands never stopped moving. Compression. The heart was muscle. Muscle responded to pressure. 7 compressions. 8. Pressure that would have seemed impossibly hard to anyone who hadn't spent 18 years forcing broken human bodies back into function with nothing but her hands, and the kind of calm that only comes from having already survived the worst thing that could happen to you. BP's coming up, the nurse said, surprise in her voice. 67/40. Sinus rhythm, the resident breathed, staring at the monitor. The heart, shocked back to work by constant pressure and pharmaceutical push, began beating on its own again. 70. 80. 92 beats per minute. Steady. Regular. Alive. For minutes. That was all it took. For minutes and a Master Chief Petty Officer's hands to restore a Purple Heart veteran's heartbeat in the middle of a regular Tuesday at St. Michael's Hospital. Danielle stepped back and stripped her gloves. The room was still silent except for the steady beep of the monitor. No one moved. Caldwell stared at the closed chest cavity that should have killed Marcus Webb, that would have killed him, that nearly did. His face had gone the color of old concrete. Someone call his family, Danielle said quietly. He's going to want them here when he wakes up. She walked back to the supply closet. Hung up her badge. Washed her hands at the sink in the break room where no one could see her, and waited. She knew what was coming. She'd been in enough operations to recognize the pattern. The hero moment. The problem moment. The elimination moment. The problem was she'd embarrassed a man with 3 phone calls already made, already cashed in, already in motion. The HR summons came at 4:48 p.m. A text to her phone from an extension she didn't recognize. Danielle was changing the dressing on a patient's arm when she felt it buzz. She read the message once, committed it to memory, and deleted it from the notification. She finished the dressing. Changed her gloves. Checked 2 more vitals. Then she walked. The administrative wing of St. Michael's smelled different from the clinical floors. Carpet instead of tile. Indirect lighting instead of fluorescent. The smell of money and institutional power instead of antiseptic and blood. Danielle's scrub suddenly felt like a costume, like someone had dressed a soldier in a clown suit and told her to pretend she belonged in a conference room. She passed Dr. Caldwell's office on the 2nd floor. He stood at the window, arms crossed, watching her walk past. Their eyes didn't meet. His jaw worked like he was chewing on words he couldn't speak yet, words that were waiting in HR, in a folder, in a legal document vetted by attorneys who knew how to make the truth disappear behind professional language. The HR director and her assistant sat on one side of a polished oak table. Danielle sat on the other. No one offered her water. The director slid a manila folder across the table with the deliberation of someone executing a carefully planned operation. "We've received serious concerns about your conduct during today's code," the director said. Her voice had the practiced sympathy of someone who'd fired 50 people in the exact same way. Specifically, unauthorized assumption of physician-level responsibilities. Danielle opened the folder. Termination letter. Single-spaced. Legally dense. The words arranged themselves like an indictment, overstepping scope of practice. Unauthorized patient contact. Creating unacceptable liability exposure. Performing procedures reserved exclusively for licensed physicians. Failure to follow chain of command. There was a signature line at the bottom. Dr. Caldwell had already signed it. You performed manual cardiac massage without a physician's authorization, the director continued. That's an open chest procedure, Ms. Ross. It's far beyond your scope as an RN. We understand your intentions were good, but intentions don't matter in medical law. Outcomes don't matter. What matters is protocol and documentation. Danielle read the letter in silence. Her hand stayed perfectly still. Her jaw didn't move. She'd been trained to absorb worse than this, to absorb live fire and inadequate supplies and the knowledge that if she made one mistake, 13 soldiers died. She could absorb this. She signed the acknowledgement without argument. No explanation. No defense. The pen moved steadily across the paper. Her signature was precise. Controlled. The signature of someone with nothing left to lose and therefore nothing to hide. "We'll need your badge and hospital ID," the director said. Danielle removed them and placed them on the table. Took back the folder. Stood up. "Security will escort you to collect your personal items," the director said, like reading from a script she'd memorized years ago. 2 guards were waiting outside the conference room. Professional security contractors, the kind who didn't ask questions and understood that escorting someone out was escorting someone out. They walked with her to the nurse's locker room. She opened her assigned locker, the same locker where she'd stored her scrubs and her stethoscope and the tarnished military challenge coin she carried every shift, tucked in the front pocket where it pressed against her ribs like a heartbeat. The guards watched while she emptied it. She didn't have much. A change of clothes. A book she'd never finished. A photo of her daughter that she'd never displayed anywhere because displaying anything meant leaving a trail, meant creating connections, meant building a life that could be erased if the wrong person looked too hard. She held the challenge coin in her palm for a moment. Corroded. Ancient. Stamped with a call sign no one here knew meant anything, Phantom 6. Unit 76, Naval Special Warfare Command, Tikrit Theater. It weighed almost nothing and everything. The guards escorted her to the parking lot exit. Dr. Caldwell watched from his second-floor office window. She could feel his eyes on her back. He was already composing the narrative. The story he'd tell the board. The story that would explain away a physician who froze while a nurse saved his patient. The story that would bury any question about why he'd needed her, why he'd relied on her, why his hands had trembled while hers stayed steady. Danielle drove home in silence, still wearing her scrubs. The termination letter sat on the passenger seat, a single page of institutional power disguised as due process. She arrived at 3:15 p.m. in the afternoon. The house was quiet. Emma was at the kitchen table with her homework, elementary school fractions spread across construction paper, the kind of problem that seemed impossibly complicated until you understood the pattern. She looked up when her mother walked in, and the confusion that crossed her face was somehow worse than any words could be. "Mommy, why are you home early?" Danielle sat down at the table without changing, without washing her hands, still in her scrubs like she'd brought the hospital's fluorescent lights into the kitchen with her. Something broke in her chest. 8 years of holding everything together, 8 years of burying her call sign and her rank and her past, 8 years of being invisible, 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 and suddenly it wasn't enough anymore. The tears came before she could stop them, before she could pull them back behind the walls that had held them for so long. Emma's eyes went wide. She'd never seen her mother cry before. Not once. "Why are you crying? What happened?" Emma's voice was small and frightened and so young. Too young to understand that her mother had just been erased again, had just been made invisible again, had just sacrificed again for reasons that the government had forbidden her to speak of. Danielle pulled her daughter close, pressing her face against Emma's hair. "I just had a bad day at work, baby," she whispered. But they both knew it was more than that. They both knew that something had fundamentally changed in the space between one heartbeat and the next. On the kitchen counter, the tarnished challenge coin sat next to her car keys, catching the afternoon light like a dying star. Phantom 6. The woman who'd saved Marcus Webb's life twice. The woman who'd followed every order and paid every price and still wasn't safe, still wasn't home, still wasn't free. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was waiting in a hospital lobby 6 days away, where a deaf veteran would turn his wheelchair toward a television screen and recognize the face of the woman the government had tried to erase. 6 days. That's all the time between a firing and a resurrection. Marcus Webb sat in the St. Michael's Hospital lobby on a Thursday afternoon, his wheelchair parked near the window, waiting for his follow-up appointment with cardiothoracic surgery. The waiting room smelled like coffee that had been sitting in its pot since 6 a.m. and the particular antiseptic-touched air of every hospital in America. A television mounted in the corner played the 2 p.m. news cycle, weather, politics, traffic, the white noise of a city moving forward without him. Then the Pentagon press conference flashed across the screen. Marcus's hands went still on his wheelchair armrests. The anchor's voice had that official timbre, the careful tone reserved for declassifications and national apologies. After a 40-year classification review, the Department of Defense has released previously sealed records from Operation Sandstorm, a classified counterterrorism initiative spanning 2008 to 2016 across multiple theaters. Among the declassified materials is the service record of Master Chief Petty Officer Danielle Ross, Navy Special Warfare Command, listed as missing in action and presumed dead following a compromise of her operational security in Tikrit, Iraq, in 2014. The photo appeared on screen. Master Chief Ross in dress blues. Eyes like someone who had learned to carry weight without showing the strain. The same eyes that had watched him from across an ICU bed. The same hands that had learned his language so he wouldn't die alone. Marcus's breath came in short, sharp pulls. He knew those eyes. He'd seen them in the darkness of a Tikrit safe house 8 years ago when a combat medic had talked him through a sucking chest wound with a voice steady as morphine, telling him in that particular way certain soldiers had that deaf didn't mean broken. Danielle had been that voice. Danielle had been the one holding his chest together when shrapnel had tried to open it. And then she'd walked out of St. Michael's Hospital in handcuffs, metaphorically speaking, fired for caring. Marcus turned his wheelchair around. He didn't ask permission. He didn't wait for discharge paperwork or follow-up instructions. He rolled himself directly to the administrative offices on the second floor, his chair moving with the purposeful speed of a man who had nothing left to lose. The elevator doors opened. The hallway smelled like drywall and old carpet. He found the administrator's office, a woman named Patricia Chen, who'd smiled at him twice and meant it both times, and he rolled straight past her assistant and into the corner office where Patricia was reviewing quarterly reports. "I need you to listen to me," Marcus said. His voice had that raw quality that comes from non-use, from years of relying on hands to speak. "And I need you to not interrupt me until I'm finished." Patricia looked up. She saw a young man, not that young, not anymore, but young to her, in a wheelchair, his face the color of someone who'd just seen a ghost that turned out to be alive. She closed her laptop. Marcus told her about Tikrit. He told her about a combat medic named Danielle Ross who'd saved his life in the dark with nothing but a steady hand and steadier voice. He told her about the ICU at St. Michael's where the same woman had spent an extra 20 minutes learning sign language because a patient mattered more to her than protocol. He told her about Dr. Caldwell humiliating her before 60 physicians. He told her about watching the Pentagon press conference, about recognizing the face of someone the government had tried to erase, someone who'd now been erased a second time by the very hospital that should have protected her. "She gave me my heartbeat twice," Marcus said. "Once in a war zone. Once in your ICU. And you fired her." The room went dead silent. Patricia's hands had gone still on her desk the way hands do when they're absorbing news that changes the shape of everything. She picked up her phone. She made 2 calls. One to the hospital's legal counsel. One to the board chairman. She said 4 words that sent both men into motion: "We have a problem." By 4 p.m., the hospital conference room was filling with people. A hospital administrator from the main campus. The chief of medicine. The compliance officer. A stone-faced veteran in civilian clothes who worked hospital security and who, when introduced, simply said one word, "Phantom 6, with the kind of recognition that made the room's air pressure change. Another security officer, older, saluted without moving his body and announced in the voice of a man who'd served, "Master Chief Petty Officer, Navy Special Warfare." A general arrived from Fort Hood 40 minutes later. General Marcus Holloway. He carried a leather portfolio, and when he opened it, the pages inside were decorated with commendation ribbons printed in miniature, the kind of official military formatting that made every civilian in the room understand they were in the presence of someone who'd walked among legends. He read the first page aloud: Bronze Star for Valor Under Fire, Helm and Province, 2011. He paused. The room held its breath. Silver Star for Exceptional Heroism, Jolin District, 2013. Another pause. The pages seemed to grow heavier in his hands. 2 purple hearts. He looked up from the document. And a Navy Cross for Extraordinary Heroism above and beyond the call of duty. The citation is still partially classified, but the Secretary of the Navy wanted this much released today. Marcus Webb sat in a chair someone had rolled over for him, and his hands began to shake. Not from weakness. From recognition. From the weight of understanding what he was witnessing, not just a woman being vindicated, but an entire military operation's worth of sacrifice finally being acknowledged. Then Marcus signed. His hands moved through the air with the particular grace that deaf communication carries, and the veteran in civilian clothes, the one who'd said Phantom 6, watched with the attentiveness of someone who understood sacred language. Marcus signed about Tikrit. He signed about the medic who'd knelt beside him in the dark and told him that deafness was just another variable to work around, like distance or darkness or blood loss. He signed about walking into an ICU 8 years later and finding that same medic in scrubs, pushing medications and learning sign language on her own time because a patient's humanity mattered more than her shift. He signed, "She saved my life in a war zone. She saved my life again in that hospital. And you fired her." Dr. Caldwell was sitting in the back of the conference room. Someone had called him once the administrators understood the scope of what was happening. His face had drained of all color somewhere around the first commendation. By the time Marcus finished signing, Caldwell looked like a man watching his reflection disappear from every mirror in the room at once. 2 hours later, FBI agents arrived. 2 women and a man, all carrying the kind of quiet authority that made security guards nod without asking questions. They had documents. They had a forensics report on Danielle's personnel file, showing alterations made by someone with administrative access codes matching Dr. Caldwell's login history. They had billing records, 3 years of inflated medication codes, falsified administration documentation, kickback payments traced through shell companies to pharmaceutical suppliers. They had emails between Caldwell and a state health inspector discussing and managing the narrative around the termination of a problematic staff member. The lead agent, a woman whose badge read Special Agent Morrison, placed a folder on the conference table. "Dr. Caldwell, you have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." Caldwell stood. His hands were trembling now, and unlike Danielle, unlike the soldiers in the room, he didn't have decades of training to transform that tremor into composure. His attorney appeared from somewhere. He'd called her the moment the agents arrived, and she placed a hand on his shoulder, but even she couldn't stop what came next. FBI agents in crisp dark suits escorted Dr. Caldwell from the conference room and down the hospital corridor. Security guards stood at attention as he passed. Staff members stepped out of hallways. By the time they reached the lobby, word had spread through St. Michael's the way hospital gossip always does, with surgical precision and unstoppable momentum. Caldwell was placed in a sedan. Handcuffs. The kind of professional degradation that leaves no room for recovery. That happened on a Thursday. By Friday, Caldwell's medical license was suspended pending investigation. By Monday, the board had voted unanimously to strip his credentials. By the following month, the state medical board had made it permanent, revocation, no possibility of reinstatement, his name added to a public registry of physicians no longer permitted to practice medicine anywhere in the United States. 6 months later, Caldwell sat in a Houston Community College classroom teaching CPR to teenagers who'd signed up for health class requirements. His name badge read Instructor. No doctorate. No title. $15 an hour. He demonstrated chest compressions on a plastic mannequin while students stared at their phones, and nobody in that room, not one person, understood that they were watching a man who'd once commanded surgical suites and influenced hospital policy, reduced to explaining to bored high schoolers where the sternum was and how hard to push. But that wasn't the moment everything changed. 1 year after Caldwell walked out of St. Michael's in handcuffs, Danielle Ross stood in the Pentagon in her Navy dress uniform. Master Chief Petty Officer. The rank was back. The title was restored. The government that had once erased her was now writing her back into existence, one official ceremony at a time. Her daughter Emma stood beside her in the gallery, wearing a dress she'd picked out herself, finally old enough to understand that her mother was someone extraordinary, not because Danielle had told her, but because the room full of generals and admirals and Pentagon officials kept using words like valor and heroism and above and beyond when they looked at her. The Secretary of the Navy approached with the commendation medals. Bronze Star first. The ribbon caught the light. Then the Silver Star, heavier somehow, despite being the same size. 2 Purple Hearts, one for each wound she'd taken, each one a price paid. And finally, the Navy Cross, the medal that made everyone in the room rise to their feet without being asked. Master Chief Petty Officer Danielle Ross, the Secretary said, his voice carrying the weight of official recognition, your service to this nation is hereby restored, acknowledged, and honored. The room erupted, the kind of applause that sounds like respect made into sound. Danielle stood with her chin level, her shoulders back, wearing the uniform like she'd never taken it off. Because in a way, she hadn't. She'd just been wearing a different one, scrubs instead of navy blues, while she did the same work she'd always done, keeping people alive. Marcus Webb sat in the front row, and when he saw her face turn toward the audience, his hand went to his chest. Right hand, spread flat over the scar, the one she'd given him by opening his sternotomy incision, the one she'd sealed by saving his life. He pressed his palm against the fabric and held it there, and tears moved down his face like rain on a windshield, and he signed with his free hand, "Thank you." Just that. One word. Everything. On her collar, twin gold anchors caught the light, 1 point up, 1 point down, the symbol of her rank finally restored. She was no longer a ghost. She was no longer erased. She was Master Chief Petty Officer Danielle Ross, and the entire Pentagon knew her name. A reporter approached her after the ceremony as she stood near the reception tables, Emma holding her hand, Marcus Webb nearby. "Master Chief, what's it like to be restored after 8 years of being erased?" Danielle touched the challenge coin in her uniform pocket, the tarnished one she'd carried through every shift at St. Michael's, the one that had reminded her daily of who she'd been. She'd carry it until the day she died. "Power is not a title," she said, her voice steady as always, moving through the room like someone who'd learned long ago how to carry impossible weight without flinching. "Power is the ability to help." Emma squeezed her hand. Marcus Webb signed his agreement, and somewhere in Houston, in a community college classroom, Dr. Caldwell erased another name from the CPR roster, his own name now the punchline in ethics seminars, in medical fraud prevention training, in case studies about what happens when arrogance meets corruption and loses every round. The gift of a heartbeat Danielle had given twice, once in darkness, once in fluorescent light, continued beating in the man who wore it. And that was everything. Hit that like button if you appreciate the nurses and healthcare workers in your life. Drop a comment if you've ever worked in medicine or know someone who has. Subscribe and let's see what happens next.